the U.S. view of Saddam changed dramatically, but not of the Kurds. The first President Bush had a ban on a meeting with the Kurds through that war. And on the 15th of February in 1991, he spoke at the Raytheon plant in Andover, Massachusetts. He called for an uprising against Saddam. And then when the uprising took place, beginning in Basra, I think on the 4th of March, and in Rania in Kurdistan on the 6th, Bush simply did nothing. He allowed Saddam to crush the uprising, even to use helicopters in spite of the no-fly zone that had been imposed to crush the uprising. And I was there in Iraqi Kurdistan during the uprising in the final days of it and narrowly escaped to Syria. That then was followed by hundreds of thousands of Kurds fleeing to the Turkish and Iranian borders. And that in turn led to a no-fly zone and a safe area in which the U.S. began protecting the Kurds, all again from the first President Bush. And this is, of course, where General Jay Garner, who is either with you today or will speak with you tomorrow, played a key role as the person administering it. The Clinton administration was basically focused on other issues, not Iraq, Bosnia, Croatia, that's where I was actually, and changes in Russia. But it did do one very useful thing. Secretary Madeleine Albright negotiated the 1998 Washington Agreement that ended the intra-Kurdish civil war. President George Bush the Younger used the Kurds as allies against Saddam in the war. But then, instead of embracing since 91, I should say, Iraqi Kurdistan had been de facto independent of Iraq. It had its own parliament and leadership, and set up an autonomous military with the Peshmerga, completely separate from Baghdad, protected by the U.S. And so it had military forces that were able to assist the Americans, especially since Turkey had not allowed U.S. troops to come across Turkey and enter Iraq from the north. The Kurds provided the troops in the north. But the thank you from President George W. Bush and Jerry Bremer, his proconsul, was to ask Barzani, as he did in February of 2004, and I was there, to disband the entire Kurdistan regional government. And so that Iraq wouldn't be it would be a federal state of 18 governorates. There wouldn't be any special thing for the Kurds, and to get rid of the Peshmerga. Needless to say, this was not acceptable to either Masoud Barzani or Jalal Talabani. There was a kind of funny moment when they were negotiating about the Peshmerga. A fellow from the Rand Corporation came up and had long negotiations with the Kurds, and it was agreed that the Peshmerga would be disbanded. They would become forest guards, mountain guards, guards of the region. As the fellow from Rand was about to go back to Baghdad, he was talking to Masroor Barzani, explaining effusively how wonderful it was that the Kurds were cooperating in a unified Iraq, getting rid of their own separate military. I think a little thought of doubt crossed his mind. And so he asked Masroor, what's the Kurdish word for forest guards? And Masroor said, oh, Peshmerga. And so the Peshmerga continued. In the constitutional negotiations, the Bush administration fought against Kurdish autonomy, especially Kurdistan's control of natural resources, but ultimately accepted it. In the Obama administration, again, I say Iraq was not a priority. It did go ahead and implement the withdrawal of U.S. troops, which had been negotiated by the George W. Bush administration. But when ISIS attacked Sinjar, President Obama actually had, I would say, the fastest response to genocide by the United States in history, probably the fastest response by any government to an ongoing genocide. The attacks began on a Monday, and on Thursday, Obama denounced what ISIS was doing to the Yazidis as genocide and launched airstrikes. I remember this kind of vividly because I'd written a strong op-ed for the New York Times denouncing President Obama for not doing anything about the genocide against the Yazidis. But by the time it was going to be published, thankfully, he had done something. And then he also started support for the Syrian Kurds, in spite of the fact that they were linked to the PKK, an organization the U.S. considers to be terrorist. The first Trump administration did continue the campaign against the Islamic State, but after the September 25th, 2017 referendum, independence referendum, the Trump administration allowed the Iraqi military, and particularly Abu Mahdi Mohandes, a man who had been convicted of and sentenced to death in Kuwait for the act of blowing up the American embassy in the 1980s. They allowed him to use American Abrams tanks to attack the Kurds in Kirkuk in an operation directed by Qasem Soleimani. And then in 2019, Trump's envoy, James Jeffrey, persuaded the Kurds to withdraw from border areas with Turkey to create a neutral zone. And then Trump gave Erdogan a green light to attack them. So having made them defenseless, he allowed them to, he gave Erdogan a green light to attack them. And this produced the resignation of his defense secretary, Mattis, of Brett McGurk, his envoy. He announced that the U.S. would withdraw from northeast Syria, but then somebody showed him pictures of oil wells and that there was oil there, so he kept the troops. Joe Biden, whom I knew very well from the time of the Foreign Relations Committee, had a great history with the Kurds. In fact, I personally introduced him to Talabani in August of 1990. He traveled to Iraq in 2002, spoke to the parliament, but I think most people would say that the administration was a disappointment. And finally, Trump's second term, it's unknown. I don't see that it will have a big negative effect on the KRG, on Iraqi Kurdistan, but its impact on Rojava, on Syrian Kurdistan, is very uncertain. Waltz, now the National Security Advisor, was co-chair of the Kurdish caucus, and Rubio, the Secretary of State, was a hawk on Kurdistan. He wanted to support the SDF, the Syrian Kurds. He is also a hawk on Ukraine, but on Ukraine, he's implementing Trump's policy of close relations with Russia and abandoning Ukraine. So it's really hard to say. There is the record of betrayal. At the time in 2019, Trump said the Kurds were bad people. It may be that the fact that Assad is no longer in power works in their favor, because as Trump cozies up to Russia, and Russia was pro-Assad, maybe the absence of Russia from Syria takes that element out of the equation. But we're a month into this administration. We simply don't know. So much for the survey of U.S. Kurdish relations. I want to turn to Syria, which is a place that I'm quite engaged in now. The first point I would make is there's been a real rush by the foreign policy establishment to embrace the HTS, the people who've taken over in Syria, and Ahmed al-Shara, the new interim president. And some of it's quite bizarre. A fellow named Charles Lister, I think, who works for the Middle East Institute, wrote a piece in Foreign Policy describing a trip from all across Syria, in which he said everybody wanted to get rid of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish military. Well, it seems highly improbable that people in northeast Syria wanted to get rid of the Syrian Democratic Forces. But all of this has encouraged Shara to think that he can impose his will in the country. So he has excluded the Kurds. They're 10% of the country's population. They control 25% of its territory. The SDF is by far the largest military in Syria. They have excluded them from the government and from the national dialogue. This was a meeting of Syrians to shape the future that was just held in Damascus, unless the SDF agrees to merge its troops into the new Syrian army, and the autonomous administration, Northeast Syria, agrees to give up its autonomy. Of course, they're not going to do, since the Syrian Democratic Forces have many more troops than the HTS or the new Syrian army. Also, because the differences between the Kurds in Syria and the HTS, it's not just ethnic, it is also ideological. So the Kurds in Northeast Syria have adopted a very interesting political philosophy. Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, he began as a Marxist, Leninist in the 1980s, modeled himself on Stalin. But, you know, after 1989, 1991, Marx and Lenin kind of were out of fashion. Then he was arrested by Turkey and put in prison, the only prisoner on Imrali Island in the Sea of Marmara. You know, the old ideology was kind of out, and somebody gave him a book in Turkish by a fellow named Murray Bookchin. Murray Bookchin was sort of a young socialist growing up in New York, but moved to Vermont when the revolution took place in Vermont, and Bernie Sanders, the socialist, became the mayor of Burlington, Vermont in 1980, won by 10 votes. And Bookchin lived in Vermont. He, of course, fell out with Sanders, but he wrote a book with a philosophy with three themes. First, that you have a bottom-up government based kind of on Vermont town meeting, that you have strict gender equality, and you have radical environmentalism. And Öcalan read this book and said, that's the new ideology, and that's what's been adopted by the PKK and by the Syrian Kurds. So the most visible way in which you see this in Northeast Syria is the gender equality. So every political party has a co-leader, a man and a woman. Each of the cantons have co-prime ministers, man and woman. The legislatures are 50-50 men and women. The civil service can no more than 60% of the positions can be from one gender. And there are the female fighters, the YPJ, and they're actually female generals. Now, contrast that with the HTS, which has run an Islamist state in Idlib in northwest Syria. And the justice minister that Shara appointed actually videotaped himself in 2015 presiding over the execution of 2 women accused of prostitution. Incidentally, the Syrian Kurds do not apply the death penalty, actually, like the Iraqi Kurds as well. So you can see such a sharp contrast in the values between the HTS and what's going on in Northeast Syria. And so logically, I would say that autonomy is really the only way that you can accommodate these different values. You know, personal status, for example, will it be Sharia law, or will it be civil law? Well, maybe the folks in Idlib will want Sharia law, but certainly the folks in Northeast Syria want civil law, issues of gender equality. And so the Syrian Kurds have put forward a proposal. Well, they already have autonomy, but in terms of what they want to protect, they want to keep their own police, they want to keep their own security, they want to run their own schools, they want to have control over the local economy, they want to control environmental issues, and so on. But they recognize that the center, the federal state, would have powers, foreign affairs, defense, oil, because the oil in Syria is in Northeast Syria. They agree that should go to the federal government, so quite different from the Iraqi Kurds. But they want some of the revenues to stay in Northeast Syria, and they want the local employment so that the people working at the oil fields, both in management and labor, would be very significantly from Northeast Syria. the Arabs basically, and this is true throughout the Arab world, they see federalism as a step to independence. There's some truth to that. When the Iraqi Kurds were negotiating the Iraqi constitution, I was with them when they were doing it. Everybody except the most deluded of the people in the Bush administration understood completely that what they really wanted was independence. So they were seeking the largest amount of, and achieved the largest amount of independence that possible in the Iraqi constitution. Iraq is called a federal state, but it's actually more like a confederal state. After all, not only the Kurds have their own, in Iraq, have their own parliament and elected president. They make their own lawmaking powers. Very few, the federal government has almost no lawmaking power in Iraqi Kurdistan. They have their own military. This is really the features of a confederal state. But that's not what the Syrian Kurds want. They are not seeking independence. Also, it's not really practical. But they do want to maintain autonomy, and they certainly don't want to be under an Islamist regime, with a justice minister who executes women. And many of the people in this Islamist regime were the very people that they were fighting against when they were fighting the Islamic State. So, so the question is, how are these issues settled? Shara has proposed a national dialogue, from which, of course, he's excluded the Kurds, and basically wants his people to write a new constitution. The Kurds, the autonomous administration, and particularly, and this has been articulated by Ilham Ahmed, one of the co-leaders, said that it should be done by an elected constitutional assembly, elected on the basis of proportional representation, and then that draft approved in a referendum. And this is basically how constitutions are done in modern times, how the Iraqi constitution was done. It's how the East Timorese constitution was done. It's the norm globally for when you're trying to do new constitutions. You don't have some committee appointed by the self-appointed leader. You have an elected assembly. Now, part of what they would want is to ensure consensus so that nobody's imposing their will on a minority. You'd say, well, the Kurds are 10% of the population, so how are they going to defend themselves in assembly? Well, they are suggesting that there should be a supermajority required to approve the constitution. That would be useful for them, but probably not essential, because you have other Syrians, the Druze and the Alawites, both of which object to a Sunni Islamist rule. Both of them are considered apostates by Islamic extremists, and the penalty for apostasy is death. But there are also a lot of secular Syrians. And so if you had an election, particularly with a proportional representation system, it's very unlikely that the Islamists would have a majority. And so that a system of bargaining in which protected civil law, protected women's rights, and provided for some autonomy for Northeast Syria might prevail. So this is really how things are playing out now. The early signs are not very encouraging. The national dialogue that just took place over, I guess, yesterday in Damascus lasted just a day, 4,000 people. Obviously not a meaningful dialogue, and not really the basis of a new constitution. The wild card in all of this is Turkey, which will it attack Northeast Syria? But there is a peace process in Turkey as well. I think we're waiting to hear from Öcalan in the coming days, in which he is supposed to announce that he will give up the armed struggle, or have his people disarm and in exchange for participation in the political process. Let me pause there and have some time for questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. We do have time for questions. You still can hear us, right? Just want to make sure. Can you still hear us, sir?
What?
Can you still hear us?
I can hear you, yes, but better without your microphone.
Okay, let me start with Joe. That was did you see that?
I'm going to ask Mr. Kurdistan to explain to Ambassador Galbraith what Öcalan said today. Can you do that? He's made that statement, Peter.
Okay.
What he said? He's made the statement about Peter. Can you elaborate? Because you told us 15 minutes ago, that Osman made a speech.
About Mr. Öcalan's statement.
Yes. Can you tell Peter this?
Did you hear, Ambassador?
Yeah, he does not know. You told me.
His statement is very clear, no more conflict
Can't hear
and
us when we use
war
it.
between PKK and Turkish government. That's it.
He's working, but he can't hear us.
I think that's I did hear you. And you know, I think that's consistent with what I, you know, understood to be happening. And that should be a good sign for for Rojava, because I mean, if you're having, if the PKK is laying down its arms, and that is the Turkey's argument is that Rojava is an ally of the PKK, then, you know, really Turkey has nothing to fear from Rojava. And, you know, Turkey's obviously much stronger than the SDF, but, you know, even when you attack a powerful country attacks a weaker entity, it can be very costly.
We go with Dr. Ersoy and Mamusta Abdullah. Dr. Ersoy?
Yeah.
So we
The microphone, I think he hears us better without the microphone.
No microphone, please.
No microphone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Very informative. I have a very brief question, and you talked about the American relations with Kurds in Iraq and in Syria, which are two parts, but you just didn't even mention American relations with Kurds in Turkey, who are probably more than half of the general Kurdish population. And you just made a passing reference that the US recognizes the PKK as a terrorist organization, and that is it. Do you think that the American governments have been helping Turkey to criminalize Kurdish demands and Kurdish political struggles in Turkey?
Well, I think these days it's impossible to speak of American policy, because it has changed 180 degrees on so many things. I mean, look at Ukraine. On the 19th of January, the United States was Ukraine's strongest ally. Today, the United States is Putin's most important ally. You know, it's hard to say. The United States, Turkey is a member of NATO. It's an important ally, and the United States government, at least in the past, has accepted Turkey's view that the PKK is a terrorist organization. I'm not sure I would agree with that judgment. I think it's an insurrectionist movement, but not necessarily terrorist. But okay, that's what they've done. But on the other hand, previous administrations have spoken out about human rights violations in Southeast Turkey, and have encouraged Turkey to take a number of steps that Turkey, in fact, has taken. For example, you know, when I first went to Southeast Turkey traveling with Chris Van Hollen, who is my colleague on the Foreign Relations Committee staff, now a senator on that committee, we traveled the entire length of the Iraq-Turkey border. At that time, the speaking of Kurdish was illegal. Today, there's education in Kurdish, there's broadcasting in Kurdish. So while there's a path to go, there also has been progress, and I'm hopeful that the Öcalan statement will translate into reality, and you know, that this issue will be addressed. I also didn't address the issue of Kurds in Iran, who are the second largest group after those in Turkey. And basically, the U.S. has had almost no contact with the Iranian Kurdish opposition, with those political parties. And it's a pretty quiet issue.
Thank you, sir. We have one question from Mamusta Abdullah.
My name is Abdullah, professor at International Relations. Peter, first of all, thank you very much actually for your books and for your contribution for the Kurdish cause. My question is will be about Rojava. as you know, I mean, nowadays, I mean, many European countries and also America, after the collapse of the Assad regimes, the APS, Jolani, I mean, party used to be a part of Al Qaeda and also ISIL, and the Kurds. They just forced the Kurds to dismantle their, forces and just to obey this jihadi regime. Do you think if the Kurds in Rojava, if they then
I didn't catch the last part of your question. Is will the Kurds in Rojava accept what is being proposed? Is that the question?
Yeah, if the Kurds in Rojava declare their independence and then make a statement to the whole of the world and say we are eager and we are ready to have for unified Syria, a federation, formal federation of a confederal state. What will happen? Because, for example, the Cyprus in 1983, they declared their independent state, but still there are negotiations between, the Cypriot governments and also the Turkish side. In 1948, when Israel declared its independence, all the Arab states attacked, the region. For Rojava region, I believe, except for Turkey, there will not be any other Arab state they attack them.
I think I have the question. So first, there isn't a significant independence movement among the Syrian Kurds. One reason is that the geography of the Kurdish areas in Syria simply doesn't allow it. There are Kurds in the northwest, in Afrin, at various places along the border. You don't have the kind of compact geographic area that makes Iraqi Kurdistan viable as an independent state. Second, this is not part of the ideology of the dominant political party, the PYD, or of the PKK. Although the PKK began as a party seeking independence, it doesn't now. It doesn't fit with the philosophy of Murray Bookchin. So the Iraqi Kurds are kind of nationalist. The dominant political party in northeast Syria is not a nationalist party, but it is a party that wants to preserve its political system, wants to preserve what it has achieved. It wants a fair share of the wealth of Syria. It wants to have civil law. So that's the basic approach. In terms of the SDF, Shara has demanded that they disband. And incidentally, a lot of the internationals have been saying the same thing, including the foreign policy establishment. But this is nonsense. Mazloum has said, yes, we'll agree to be part of the Syrian army, but as units. Units stationed in the northeast, where Shara says, yes, you should join the Syrian army, but we get to assign where you go, in short, dismantle you. And then there's the separate issue militarily of the YPJ, the female fighters, which are a very significant force in northeast Syria. It was a significant part of the campaign against the Islamic State. One of my trips there, I went to the front lines. It was all women, and that's where I saw my first ISIS fighter. His head was largely separated from the rest of him because he had died attacking the position of these women fighters. It was kind of unfortunate for the fellow because apparently, if you're killed by a woman, you don't get your 72 doe-eyed virgins in heaven. But anyhow. Those groups are, Shara obviously has no interest in having any women in the Syrian military. So the SDF is not going to disband. there might be some face-saving formula in which they become part of the Syrian army. They put different patches on their shoulders. But, at the moment, Shara believes he has a much stronger hand than he actually does. And remember, there are other parties in Syria that also have their military. For example, the Druze in Suwaida in the southwest are in an area that the Israelis have said, we're not going to allow any Syrian military forces to come. And they're basically protecting the Druze militia that's there. The Alawites, who, of course, were mainstays of the Assad regime, they were the leaders in the old Syrian army. They don't have a militia at the moment, but there are a lot of people with a lot of military expertise. And so, that's a potential problem. The real choice that for Shara is whether Syria is going to be Libya or whether it could be, well, I guess the best analogy would be Iraq, a federal state, which still hangs together in spite of the differences among elements of the population. But again, there is no separatist movement in Syria, whereas every Iraqi Kurd, and that included, the various Kurdish presidents of Iraq, actually wanted to have an independent Kurdistan and not be part of Iraq.
We have time for maybe a couple of more questions, sir. I think yes, go ahead, please.
So you read the piece of Charles Lister. Do you think it's so logical that you have so many analysts now are basically calling on the RCF to basically integrate it in a former Al-Qaeda-led entity? Like, is it so logical? And why do you think that so many European countries and also the US, they go with this argument? Is it because of the refugees or the political interests? Why do you think there's now all this change?
Well, first, I don't think that reflects any U.S. policy, because I think there is no U.S. policy at the moment of the new administration. In terms of I guess that I would say, to be a little kinder, there's a large community of Middle East experts who are Syria people, and they are people who have chronicled and observed the Assad regime over 50 years. Their friends are Arab Syrians, from also Christian Syrians, and so they share the euphoria of Assad being overthrown. I approach, although I have many friends who are in the Arab side, I approach this as somebody who sort of sees it from the Kurdish point of view, which they don't. And so I think that's an explanation of why you're getting this viewpoint. From the Europeans, well, again, I think a lot of the foreign policy establishment in Europe, including people who are in government, also see this the same way. There's the additional element that they would like refugees to return. I have a colleague who has been going very regularly to Idlib and spending time with Shara when he was Golani. And she says that, she's argued for a long time that his conversion is genuine. And I'm prepared to believe that. A lot of his statements are right, but his colleagues are not necessarily reconstructed at all. Again, you have a justice minister who, videotaped himself executing 2 women. You have a defense minister with a lot of innocent blood on their hands. And there's a question of even how long Shara himself will last. So, this is why I think what Ilham Hamid and the Syrian Autonomous Administration are calling for, which is an elected constitutional assembly to draft a constitution, and then you'll have bargaining, is key, rather than rushing this process and having a constitution and future arrangements dictated by Shara. or his colleagues. And the important point here is that until there is a new arrangement, until there is a constitution, then the existing arrangements should remain, meaning the autonomy in Northeast Syria and the SDF.
We have one more question, I think.
Peter, I actually have two questions, but it will be a quick one. How dispensable are the Kurds to the US, regardless of who the president is? Let's remember that we lost Kirkuk and what was the name of town in Syria? Afrin during the Trump administration. That's the first question. Second question is that regarding delisting PKK, just like the recent HTS delisting, how likely is it?
Well, first, I think it matters greatly who the U.S. president is, and the history of U.S. presidents is very different. You had, just to go in this century, you had George Bush Jr. or George W. Bush, who launched a war that got rid of Saddam Hussein. And even though his initial desire was to destroy Kurdish autonomy, he ended up accepting Kurdistan's autonomy and the continuation of the Peshmerga. But he made, by getting rid of Saddam, he made possible the modern Kurdish state. You have Obama in terms of Syria, who responded incredibly quickly to the Yazidi genocide and then began to support the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, even though they were linked to PKK. And then you had Trump, who basically in 2017 said, allowed a terrorist, somebody who had blown up an American embassy, to use Abrams tanks to attack the Kurds. And then in 2019, gave a green light to Erdogan to seize a territory in northeast Syria. So there is a big contrast as to who is the U.S. president. In terms of delisting, the U.S. has not delisted the HTS. It has eliminated the $10 million bounty on Shara's head, but it hasn't delisted the HTS. I imagine that it will not quickly delist the PKK. And I'm not sure that it would matter whether Trump or Biden were president. It's just the nature of the U.S. government in that kind of situation. The irony is both the PUK and the KDP were considered terrorist organizations until, I don't know, somewhere around 2006, they were still on the list. And so every time that President Talabani, the president of Iraq, had to go to the US or his colleagues, they had to get some kind of special visa waiver. And eventually that was taken off, but it certainly was not taken off quickly. So I can't imagine that the process with the PKK will go quickly, maybe not for the HTS either.
Ambassador, during your talk in the beginning, you said generally Kurds have no friends but the mountains. I want to thank you for being a mountain for the Kurds.
Well, you're kind to so say.
You are more than welcome.